Yeah, and when it comes to the role model discussion, I think that's a big issue in and of itself because as you were pointing out, a lot of the most dominating both for young men and women in that space are the ones that pander to say even what the shadow side of both of those genders would want, right? And I think that's actually one of the main faults of the manosphere, so to say, is that they don't turn the conversation back into a one around responsibility and unification like say a Jordan Peterson often would. They actually take the more radical feminist frame and say, yes, relationships are a power dynamic. They aren't necessarily a two-way street. It's that you just need to be on top. And so that becomes the narrative. And then you have these role models for young women, giving them relationships are a power dynamic. You need to be in control. And then you've got young men getting the same narrative, just flipped. But the one that the issue that I do see is that when it comes to mainstream acceptance of those ideas, there is an imbalance in the sense where, if you walk in and you hear Andrew Tate can play to his crowd and does very well doing that. However, that person sits down at the dinner table with my parents and he would break their brain. However, you hear a, say, more female role model sit down and talk about these more the outgrowth of the sexual revolution, and I'm just being free. I'm just trying to explore myself by doing this and getting around or modeling online and so forth. And there's less hesitation to push back against that, I find, from a societal level. And this gets to where I actually was where we reached out to you from, is this concept that we've been toying with recently, which is the differing predation models for genders, what we call the gendered predation paradigm. But what I see here happening is that you've got the masculine failure mode of essentially masculine tyranny, which is, yes, piped through a lot of these more manosphere content where you need to be powerful, you need to make people bend to your will, and essentially, rely on force. And that leads its way into a lot of criminal behavior, right? Just if you want something, just go out there and take it through strength. And then you've got the more feminine failure mode, which I see as promiscuity, and which is being channeled through adult content generation in the way that, because actually Peterson said this in a podcast about a year or two ago that it stuck with me, and I couldn't make sense of what he meant by it. But he said, the pornography is just criminality for females. And I was like, I can't make sense of that. Like, it's not breaking any laws. What is it? And then what I realized is, okay, it's actually just them using their biological, and this is where I wanted to get your input on it, is they were using their biological virtues and strengths, being beauty, in order to extract resources from the vulnerable. And I see that being the exact same with men in force of, okay, you want somebody's resources that's weaker than you, just go take it. And that these play out. And so what happens then when we have one of these predation paradigms rightfully being shamed, but then the other one is culturally accepted? And yeah, where does that lead?
Well, there's a lot in what you said. To go back to the beginning of it, the battle over whose fault this is and what should be done, what should have been done, looks exactly like a marriage gone bad. Okay, this is what the arguments look like. And this is what I see as somebody who does not at least directly have a dog in this fight. As a happily married person, I'm not looking for anybody. So I can look at both sides of this argument. And I see both parties, the males and the females, pointing at the other and saying, you did this to us. And I see elements of truth in both of those arguments, and I see elements of delusion. And at one level, the right thing to do if you wanted to save this, and civilization is depending on us saving it, is to declare a kind of amnesty and say, this was a dynamic, it's unhealthy, it's bad for everybody, and it was the result of errors on both sides. Now, that's not an easy thing to do. It's the reason that the divorce rate is so high, is that even people who were compatible with each other and get into a bad dynamic have a very hard time steering back to the functional dynamic. Frankly, it's one of the things that sex is supposed to enable you to do. And we have lost this because we've turned sex into something else. I move back and forth between thinking of the dynamics in this relationship as predatory and parasitic. Both of these metaphors have relevance to what's unfolding. I do think you have Jordan's statement, you've evaluated it correctly, that some women are able to transfer the wealth of men to themselves by distributing sexual content online. But just as it is with the males at the top of the mating hierarchy who are taking advantage of a bunch of women at once, almost nobody's in this position, right? It may be possible as a woman to make a ton of money as an influencer, but any given woman is very unlikely to come out ahead with that strategy. So as with, kids in a depressed community who look at sports stars who are making tens of millions of dollars and think, well, that's the obvious thing I want to do, you have to think alongside, well, what are the chances that I actually have what it takes to do that? So you've got a tiny number of women parasitizing men very successfully. You've got a tiny number of men parasitizing women very successfully, and everybody else is harming themselves in the process of trying or harming themselves in the process of standing outside the system idling. That is if you could stand outside the system and properly understand the likelihood of succeeding in any of the modes that look enviable, you would ask, shouldn't we overthrow this? Right? Why are we participating in a system where a tiny number of people are getting unbearably wealthy and the rest of us have nothing to show for it? So I see a lot in that model, and I think the reason that it doesn't break, is that young people do not really understand that there is an alternative, right? They look at old movies or books or whatever, and they think either, well, but if I look at a book from 80 years ago and it describes a relationship I might want, it came in the context of a world that wouldn't allow me to join the profession I want to. So maybe they think it's impossible for that reason. Or they think it's just a story. It's a fantasy. This stuff didn't really exist, which, some of it didn't, but a lot of it did. And it's very hard if you didn't grow up in a position to see it, right? And who alive today did, right? The boomer generation was pretty screwed up, right? And, the boomers are now dying off. So that means that the younger generation that is formulating a strategy hasn't seen a generation in which gender relations worked.